We still do 7 NUFC Matters shows for free a week. But if you want to support the channel, there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast or video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications option. Hit the thanks button to buy a super sticker. You can do this on the live chat too. You can also join our Patreon page or buy us a coffee at the link in all of our video descriptions below. We are also looking for sponsors. If you want our latest advertising rates and how you can get involved, then email John at nufcmatters1892@gmail.com. Thanks for watching. A big thanks to all our sponsors, Skips and Bins. You can find them at their website, skipsandbins.com. Contact them, www.skipsandbins.com/contact. Say hello to low-cost waste disposal with pay-as-you-go and contract waste management. Big thanks to Media Arts for all the technical side of things. And a thanks to our fanzine sponsor, United Group Travel, UK Coach Holidays, established 2020. There are no strangers in our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. 2026 tours, 2 crew, driver and courier, local family company, 3-star plus quality hotels, no interchanges, hot and cold snacks and drinks available on the coach, all excursions included. Website www.unitedgrouptravel.com. Email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com. Telephone 01670 632 460 or mobile 0791 666 4174. Just £30 per person deposit. Big welcome to GC Competitions, a new sponsor. A day none of us will forget. This is your chance to win this stunning Newcastle United signed Carabao Cup final winners display with replica medal. For only $1.99 a ticket, you can be the proud owner of this piece of Tyne history. The draw will take place on Sunday the 18th of January. Don't miss out. Get your tickets now at www.gccompetitions.co.uk. If you want to support the channel, you can hit the subscribe button. It's free. We do 7 shows a week. Hit the thumb up to like the channel and click share to your social media. If you like to listen to us as a podcast, you can find us on Sports Social Podcast Network or iTunes or Spotify or other podcast providers.
Attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again, but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you, you're the only thing that makes us all believe.
Good afternoon, welcome along to NUFC Matters. It is a Q&A with Ben Jacobs. Ben will be here in the next couple of minutes. Happy birthday to Paul Charlton in the chat today, 54. He doesn't look a day over 53, let's face it. But happy birthday, Paul. Let's hope you get what you want, which of course will be 3 points tonight and progress into the next stages of the Champions League. And whilst we're waiting for Ben, I will just give you a little build-up to tonight's game, which sees us in Champions League action with a penultimate one of 8 games that we've had to play in the new format of the Champions League. We have 10 points from 6 games, which places us 12th in the 36-team league ahead of tonight's game. And the top 8 qualify. The next 16 advance to a 2-legged playoff. Teams finishing 9th to 16 seeded in that playoff and enjoying home advantage in the second leg. So a lot to play for tonight, but ideally 3 points in the bag puts us in a wonderful, wonderful position going into the next stage of the Champions League. Team news, well, Fabian Shaw, Tino Livramento, Jamal Lascelles and Emil Kraft all remain out Eddie Howe confirming on Tuesday that William Asula and Dan Burn would also be absent. It's presumed, though, that Jacob Murphy won't feature either. Bookings for Malik Chow or Joe Linton would see them serve a one-game ban next week in Paris. Dan Burn is also in the same situation. Maybe a couple of planned bookings tonight maybe it'd be helpful if Newcastle can get themselves into that kind of position where it doesn't really matter. PSV, well, Ismail Salabari and Anas Salah Eddin were both in the Morocco squad, beaten in Sunday's AFCON final. It remains to be seen whether they will feature tonight. A 2-1 win at Fortuna Sittard on Saturday extended Peter Boss's side's lead at the top of their league to 16 points as they seek a third successive title. PSV have now won 17 of their 19 league games, drawing one and losing the other. 6 Champions League fixtures, meanwhile, have brought them 8 points, leaving them 21st in the table. At home, they lost 3-1 to Union SG. They thumped Napoli 6-2, went down by the odd goal in 5 to Atletico Madrid on the road, and they drew 1-1 at Bayer Leverkusen and Olympiacos, and memorably they beat Liverpool 4-1 at Anfield. Well, let's face it, not as a hard a task as it probably would have been last year. Since a 2-3 defeat at Go Ahead Eagles last March, PSV have remained unbeaten away from home in all competitions, a run that currently stands at 18 matches. Referee tonight is Daniel Siebert. He is from Germany. 6 reds in the 16 games that this official has handled so far this season, including one for the visitors in PSV's 6-2 home win over Napoli. And anyone looking for any positives may note that the last twice that Siebert officiated a game involving Nick Walter-Marta, both in last season's Bundesliga, the player scored. VAR is, of course, in operation in the Champions League, and it is Bastian Dankert who is in charge of that, and he is from Germany. UK TV tonight, well, if you want to watch it, it is on TNT Sports. There are a few bars in the Toon Centre who are covering it. The Dog and Parrot on Clayton West Street and Wonderbar in the Gate. DJ Mad Mick will be running over the proceedings there as usual. Okay, let's bring in our friend and friend of the show, Ben Jacobs. How are you, Ben?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, Happy New Year, Happy Christmas, Happy Birthday, and all of those things that we've probably missed since August. Great to have you back on, mate.
Glasses for you?
Well, new glasses. I've got about 3 pairs of glasses. I've got a pair for the show. I've got a pair for reading, and I've got a pair for going out in. So yeah, but yeah, it's a different look, mate. It's a different look. But
very smart.
Great to have you on, mate, again. And I know you're so busy, mate, so I don't like to bother you. And it's just good getting you on when there's transfers to talk about and lots of rumours. So I am going to hand it over to the people in the chat because there's a few questions coming in already, and then I'll revert back to mine if we've got time. Ben, do you think Newcastle might go for Ivan Toney, says Tom?
No, I don't think so. So Toney, as I revealed last year, unlikely to leave Al Ahly in the winter. We'll see obviously what happens during the summer, but on a massive wage and has to stay there for 2 full tax years. Otherwise, he's going to get a big bill. So we heard a lot of rumours about clubs coming in for Ivan Toney now, not just Newcastle United, but West Ham were linked with a move to, some even said Villa towards the back end of last year, and Tottenham, of course, because of the Thomas Frank connection. But Al Ahly want Toney to stay. And maybe 6 months ago, had Thomas Tuchel called up Ivan Toney and kind of said, you're in the mix for the World Cup, the player might have explored options mid-season. But I think Toney realises that there's other people ahead of him, whether rightly or wrongly, in the pecking order for the World Cup. And he's happy to stay in Saudi Arabia, and Newcastle have got PSR. Now, I know that people will say, isn't it just PIF dealing with PIF? Couldn't they do a deal whereby all of the wage is still paid, or the vast majority, by the PIF Saudi club Al Ahly, allowing Newcastle to get a really preferable deal? But we've spoken about this with Neves before as well. When a Saudi club controlled by PIF wants to keep a player like Ivan Toney, and a side like Newcastle owned by PIF, even if hypothetically wanted Ivan Toney, there's only really going to be one winner in that negotiation, and it wouldn't be Newcastle. So people kind of constantly in the media allude to the fact that Newcastle have an advantage because it's PIF talking to PIF. But if anything, it's a disadvantage because the Saudi clubs don't want to lose their star players. Any exodus is not good for the optics of the league and the politics, therefore, of Newcastle in particular doing a deal with a PIF club are really difficult. So there's nothing, as far as I'm aware, in links with Ivan Toney and Newcastle. And Nick Voldemar has come in. Johan Wisser's there as well. So number 9 is not necessarily the biggest priority anymore for Newcastle. It's obviously trying to see in these last days of the window if they can do anything in defence.
Okay, I'm going to ask you before I get into a couple of the questions here. Have Newcastle got money to spend, Ben, in your opinion? Because Eddie's playing it down massively. Blaming PSR, of course, those 3 letters that we're sick of hearing as Newcastle fans. We did make a substantial sale in the summer. We did, of course, as well spend a substantial amount of money. Some may say wasted money. That's how it feels, certainly, to some fans this season so far. But yeah, in your opinion, have Newcastle got money to spend this winter? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Eddie Howe has said that there is money to spend for the right name. It's just difficult mid-season, so they're not in as bad a PSR bind as perhaps they were in that summer when Elliot Anderson and Yakuba Minter ended up departing and Anthony Gordon nearly went to Liverpool. They're in a financial year, the current one, where they've got Champions League football. It's difficult under PSR, even though it's phasing out. And the same with UEFA FFP, because the Champions League extension of 8 games takes you to the end of the January window. And therefore, you don't know if you've qualified for the knockout stage and the money that comes with that until essentially the window ends. And a lot of clubs, and I'm sure Newcastle are included in this, are reticent to spend yet until they know definitively if they're going to get that knockout stage money. And obviously in Newcastle's case, it's highly likely that best case scenario is a playoff. And as a consequence, they wouldn't know until after the January window shuts. So they have to be cautious. And we've said this many times that the budgetary aim versus the football aim are 2 different things. So Newcastle, like Chelsea, like Tottenham, like Manchester United, will not be budgeting at the beginning of the season for Champions League football, for, in Newcastle's case and Chelsea's case, Champions League knockouts. That's not to say they don't think they can get to the knockouts. So again, to be clear, you got your football aim really lofty, you got your financial aim. You have to be really pessimistic when you make the projections. And that's why money's tight. But there is room to make a signing. It's just a case of, if they do it, they're either moving forward summer money or they're hoping they're on track to make the knockouts of the Champions League. And as a consequence, they can kind of offset that spend. And the challenge for Newcastle is, along with FFP, where everyone abides by a 70% number of allowing you to spend that percentage of your revenue on transfers, on wages, on agent fees, squad cost ratio, which is the new domestic rules that come in, will help Man United, regardless of how well they succeed on the field, because their brand has always generated a lot of revenue. Whereas Newcastle, even though under PIF, they found new revenue streams, are not quite at the same level as Manchester United, record revenue in their last financial year of over £600 million. The same for Chelsea, because they're a London club. They've got a lot of properties that they obviously have moved from the football club to the parent company. In addition to that, they've got an academy that generates a lot of money. So Newcastle possibly are going to have a sustained period of commercial growth and ultimately Champions League football to catch up that revenue gulf if they're to maximize the slack that you get compared to PSR with squad cost ratio. And yet at the same time, and this is the irony, if they keep qualifying for the Champions League, they will remain bound by FFP, regardless of the fact that the numbers and the spending ability under squad cost ratio is a little bit more generous. So the long and short of it is, the infrastructure and the model of Newcastle, including its commercial growth, including any new stadium, including a sustained period in the Champions League, all of that needs to catch up with the so-called Big Six. And if they get 3, 4, 5 years consistently in Champions League football, they can have more money to spend, and their budgetary projections can start to rise and match the football ambition of the club, which is obviously sky high. But right now, they have to be a little bit cautious. And if they do anything mid-season, then likely they're taking some of their summer budget and moving it forwards. And as a consequence, there's caution not to panic buy or overspend, as opposed to potentially, if the right target in defence doesn't present itself, waiting until the summer to get the right name in which case someone like Matt Targett could come back. There's an extended recall clause on his loan. And what I sense, which is a clue that Newcastle are trying to do business, is they're going to wait and wait and wait, maybe even see if they make the playoff phase or better for the Champions League, and then right towards the end of the window, make a judgment call on Matt, bring him back if they can't find a defensive reinforcement, leave him at Middlesbrough if they can, and then do something really late in the window.
Does the window not shut earlier for that kind of deal, though, where on a recall of a loan?
Yeah, but my understanding is they've extended it. So usually the recall clause would expire somewhere between 7 and 10 days before the window shuts, because obviously the club that have the player want a situation where they're not sweating right until the final minutes of the window. But my understanding is that Newcastle have actually been able to negotiate an extension which will allow them to delay a decision on whether they're going to bring the player back for somewhere around 7 more days. I don't think, to my knowledge, making a few calls on it yesterday, it will be right until the end of the month or the first few days of February. But essentially, they've bought themselves about another week. And that, again, is a clue that they're clearly exploring targets. If they find a target, they'll do something. If they don't, they'll bring the other target or Taggart back from Middlesbrough. And those are the sort of 2 options.
I think they'll be murder on if they bring Taggart back.
Well, I mean, but it's better than nothing, right? Because if you can't find the right target, if you can't do something mid-season, then you wait and you make sure that you don't leave yourself thin. And it's usually frustrating when you're a fan of a football club and you think, why is my club not doing anything? But if you look at everyone else looking for a defender at the moment, there's not that many fullbacks on the move, and centre-backs you're having to overpay for. Manchester City only got Mark Gahey because they paid a total package in the region of £30 million. Liverpool desperately need a centre-back. They've not done anything yet. Chelsea are trying to get a starting centre-back, but Rennes are asking 65 million euros or more for Jeremy Jacquet. So if other clubs were finding a centre-back at the level of Newcastle and they were not in those type of conversations, that's one thing. But I think several clubs are struggling. Palace haven't got a replacement yet in for Mark Gahey. Bournemouth want to bring in somebody maybe now or the summer because they know that Marcos Senesi is going to be leaving on a free transfer. So that's the challenge in all of this. Usually in January, when it's mid-season, it's a World Cup year and you have urgency, the buyer has to overpay. And whereas Newcastle may argue they've got budget, the last thing they'll want to do is financially not get value for money, because that might have a knock-on effect in the summer. And this is why there's caution. But they've definitely not shut up shop and said the window's over, we're not doing anything. They will try and use the final 10 days or so of the window to bring in a defender in particular, because due to injury, that is obviously the most pressing priority as it stands.
Why is it club's debt not included in financial calculations, asks Slade.
Well, I mean, clubs' debts are, because anything that you have on your books that is an outlay or something owed is factored into the financial calculations. But of course, what you can do with debt is borrow in a way such as revolving credit, which isn't classified, or you can have your debt historical and therefore not on a current financial cycle if it's PSR. So some debt or some outlays of that area are factored into financial calculations, but not every kind of debt. For example, an interest-free loan, which was the big contention that Manchester City had before the rules got changed. A shareholder loan in particular that was interest-free was not part of the financial calculations. And then Manchester City challenged that and the rules were amended. So some kind of borrowing or debt is part and parcel of the financial calculations, but there's ways around it. And obviously in multi-club, you can saddle the borrowing and the debt on your parent company, and as a consequence, avoid it being on the holding company of your football club. So this is kind of the challenge for Newcastle in many ways, that multi-club in particular. So it's not even necessarily big six or just bigger clubs, but multi-club infrastructure effectively allows more flexibility and more loopholes, which means that some clubs can legally circumvent various financial rules to balance the books that Newcastle can't do at the moment. And by the way, a lot of people ask me, why wouldn't Newcastle just be multi-club? Why wouldn't they tack on to PIF's ventures? And why wouldn't they essentially have a direct affiliation with the Saudi clubs in particular? And the answer to that question is really interesting, because PIF will not own the 4 clubs in Saudi Arabia by the time we reach the 2034 World Cup. And some say by the time we reach 2030, when the vision is realized. So right now, there's a lot made of PIF, Newcastle, and those 4 Saudi clubs, Al Ahly and Al Nassr, Al Ittihad and Al Hilal. But Al Hilal are about to be taken over by a private investor, and PIF will leave. And that was part of a roadmap from day one. So PIF's control of the 4 Saudi clubs was only meant to be medium term at best. And now, one by one, over the next kind of 6 months to 4 years, each PIF-controlled club will get a brand new, independent, fully private owner. So now it looks like PIF have got all these resources, and Newcastle could be part of a multi-club, and they could do exactly what Chelsea do or Ineos do. But actually, by the time we get to 2030, it's very likely that none of those 4 clubs will be controlled by PIF. And that, I think, is why we haven't really seen a connection formally in terms of multi-club between Newcastle and the Saudi sides or anything else within PIF's football portfolio.
Gary says, Ben, after Eddie denied it during his press conference and the link being false, what do you know about the links to Ryan?
Yeah, Ryan's going to Bournemouth. That's my understanding. Newcastle had an interest but never made an offer or engaged in any talks. And it's perfectly normal, isn't it, for a manager, when direction of travel is for a player to go to another club, to say we were never interested. Commonplace. And it's what a lot of well-run clubs do, because they try and keep the negotiation private, make an inquiry. If the player's going somewhere else, then ultimately you were never in the race, at least publicly when asked. But Ryan, very talented, viewed by Bournemouth as a replacement to Antoine Semenyo. Agreement in principle in place for Bournemouth. Like I say, Newcastle never made a formal offer. Fee, as we revealed on TalkSport a few weeks ago, is in the region of 35 million euros. Actually, Bournemouth only wanted to pay 30 million euros, but they've gone a little bit higher. But of course, add-ons are included in that deal. And the player's been given permission to undergo a medical. So barring any hijack or surprises, Newcastle won't be involved in that. And Bournemouth are going to get that deal over the line. And unlike Newcastle spending that amount of money on a young player that will need some time to develop, very much for the now and for the future, Bournemouth have had £65 million or so for Antoine Semenyo from Manchester City. And as a result, they can spend that kind of money and be a bit more aggressive in the market, whereas Newcastle haven't and don't plan for a major outgoing. So that would be a lot of money for them to spend. And my feeling is that if they hit that kind of valuation, 30 to 35 million, again, it would be on a defender, because that's where the urgency is, rather than investing in a young attacker, however talented, that isn't going to solve Eddie Howe's problems in the short term.
Benny says, prediction for this, Ben. Man City are closely monitoring Tino Livramento's contract situation and will expect a deal for around £60 million this summer. And Liverpool and beloved Man United are monitoring Tonali. Are we going to have to brace ourselves for more big names to leave Newcastle, do you think, Ben, in the summer? Those 2 names are the ones that people are worried about. But are Newcastle likely to have to sell again in the summer?
Well, with Tonali, he extended, and as a consequence, there's no urgency from Newcastle's perspective. And I'm not aware with Tonali that it could play out in the same way as Alexander Isak, whereby the player really agitates for a move. When he was banned, he was deeply supported by Newcastle and very appreciative of that. So I think they're relatively calm about the Tonali situation, and what Newcastle may need or not need to do come summer will in part be based on how far they go in the Champions League this season and if they get Champions League football for next season. So it's a little bit too early to assess what Newcastle's financial position will be. And it's more about, I'm told, FFP compliance, which runs calendar year, January to December, rather than squad cost ratio. Because even though I said before that Newcastle will be less benefited by squad cost ratio than clubs with consistent record revenue in the Big Six, the first year of squad cost ratio is almost like a free hit for everyone as far as the domestic rules are concerned. So the UEFA rules are another thing, and you can currently have to abide by them. And that, by the way, is why it was argued there shouldn't be a cap or a so-called anchoring, which was part of the original proposal, because the actual cap or anchoring is the better you do and the more European football you get, the more you're bound by the FFP numbers still, whereas the clubs that don't have European football have a higher percentage of revenue that they can spend on wages, agent fees and transfer fees. And as a result, they're working to more leeway comparative to the clubs that do qualify for European football. And that is sort of the check and the balance in the view of a lot of clubs within the Premier League. But in that first year of SCR, if we're only talking about the domestic rules, the penalties that will come in the future, whether fines or ultimately sanctions, they're transitioned in because everyone's got to get used to it. So the first year is a bit of a free hit. And as a consequence, with the penalties being relatively non-existent or more lenient as everyone acclimatizes to the new rules, I think you're going to see a lot of clubs spend big over the summer, knowing that they can take advantage of that loophole. And we'll wait and see whether Newcastle United are going to be one of them. But yeah, relatively quiet on the Tonali front. I'm not, by the way, aware of Manchester United entering that race either. Man United, like Elliot Anderson and Carlos Baleba and Angelo Stiller and Adam Wharton, but they will sign 2 midfielders. But as I say, Newcastle haven't had any approaches for Tonali, and they're relatively calm about that particular situation. And who was the second player in the question? I think you're muted, Steve.
I am, yeah. Tino Livramento and Man City, Ben, was the other one.
Yeah, Tino Livramento. So Ross Wilson, when he came in, had 2 imminent priorities. Extend Sven Botman, done, and extend Tino Livramento. And as I broke about 3 months ago, Livramento was slightly more reluctant to extend comparative to Botman, which is why it's taken a little bit more time. And the talks with Livramento even predate Ross Wilson. So yes, it's true that Man City are interested in Tino Livramento. And if he doesn't sign fresh terms between now and the summer, keep an eye on that situation, because Man City have a serious interest in Tino Livramento. But of course, Newcastle United don't want to sell. We're, again, not yet in a position where we can say categorically they need to sell. They have to have a big outlay. Somebody's going to have to go. They're going to be forced into another star leaving. Because first of all, like I said, let's see what they do on the field. And second of all, they will have some drop-offs on amortization as the 3-year cycle of PSR changes into squad cost ratio, coupled with the fact that if Kieran Trippier goes, they get that wage off the books too. So it's not all doom and gloom financially for Newcastle, but they definitely are still working on Tino Livramento, and there's no breakthrough yet on those contract talks. And Man City, if he becomes available in the market, are, I'm told, the club within England to watch, and Bayern also hold an interest in the player.
Will they have the same manager, though, Man City? Lots of rumours flying around about Pep Guardiola potentially going, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, Pep Guardiola is obviously either going to go summer 2027 or this summer. And a lot of sources think that he might go at the end of the season. But he's just been backed in the market by Antoine Semenyo and Mark Gahey. And Guardiola, I know it sounds kind of odd, but you can understand why, maybe because he's not really been in this position of Man City being defensively frail, of them being inconsistent, of them not being as dominant as they were in the past. He started the season, and I was with him in pre-season in America for the Club World Cup as well, more motivated to turn this around. So you would think managers are at their most happy when they're just serial winners and trophies are coming for fun. But Guardiola is conscious that this is his biggest challenge since he's been at Man City. And he doesn't just want to depart, leaving the club in a sort of period of flux and limbo. They backed him 2 Januaries ago. They backed him over the summer, and they've backed him again during this January as well. And I sense Guardiola, when he leaves Man City, would in an ideal world like to feel like he's turned the project around. And however bad Man City do, you wouldn't have thought that the hierarchy will consider moving him along. So it's probably in Guardiola's control when he chooses to go, regardless of results on the football field. But they had a disastrous loss to Bodo yesterday. They dropped points at the weekend in the Premier League as well. So it's really challenging for Man City. And yeah, Pep Guardiola could go, and imminently, and Pep Guardiola could be replaced by Enzo Maresca. He's one of the candidates, but not the only one. So that's a fascinating situation to watch. But of course, if they go for Livramento, this would be a deal driven by Hugo Viana, and anyone that replaces Pep Guardiola would have a lot of synergy and continuity with the Manchester City manager, which is why Maresca is one of the candidates. So I don't actually think whether Pep stays or goes, it will massively affect Man City's targets or their recruitment. But what it may change is, you know, some players want to join City simply because they want to play for Guardiola. And if the manager is a driving factor in a player's decision, if anyone approaches that player mid-season, they'll be asking the question, am I playing under Pep or am I playing under a different manager? And it may be at this stage that Man City don't even have the answer to that question.
Gary says, any news on Gabriel from Lecce and Sayers from Club Brugge?
Yeah, there's a few options that Newcastle are looking at. I'm not actually too aware at this stage that things are advancing with Gabriel and Lecce. So far, the defensive targets that I'm aware of for Newcastle are Brooke Norton-Cuffy, who is right back, but can double up if needed at centre back at a push. And he is going to be available from Genoa for somewhere in the region of 20 million euros, as I broke exclusively a few days ago. So that might be one to watch. Everton and West Ham and Napoli and Juventus have all made inquiries. He's just back from a muscular injury, only a minor one, but he's basically played every single game for Genoa and every single minute as well this season. So let's see whether Newcastle advance things there. I think they really like Dayan Mathali, who is at Toulouse, and a bit like Norton-Cuffy, he's capable of playing at a fullback or a centre-back. And the only real difference is that Norton-Cuffy is right cover, which feels quite pressing because of the Livramento injury. And on the left-hand side, you've got the ability to maybe add another fullback as well because they're so depleted defensively. But it would be an advantage to have somebody like that kind of profile on Norton-Cuffy because they can play in more than one position. And then rather than Gabriel, which I don't think is developing at this point, we'll wait and see whether that changes. I know they made an initial inquiry about 10 days ago, but I think since then there hasn't been any kind of direct meeting with Club Brugge, but things can of course move really quickly in the final days of the window. With Lecce, I should say, not Club Brugge, with Sayers and Club Brugge. That one is a little bit more advanced at this stage in terms of the conversations that have taken place. And Newcastle have been scouting Sayers for quite some time. So this would not really be something they just do out of impulse or opportunism. This is a player that they've been looking at for quite some time. And I was told with Sayers that Bruges don't want to sell in the winter. Shock horror, that's virtually every seller during this window. And Newcastle always had a plan, again, even before Ross Wilson, to consider doing something for summer. So let's see whether they choose to push that forwards. But if they do, they're going to face heavy competition from several clubs all around Europe. I'm told Lazio and Villarreal have both looked. Aston Villa have sent scouts to watch the player relatively recently, and Leverkusen took a look as well in the last few weeks. So Bruges are going to be quite difficult to negotiate with there, but I think Sayers and Norton-Cuffy feel like slightly more active internal conversations at Newcastle at the moment than Gabriel. And Now I think they're going to determine, can they get any one of these names over the line? And if not, they might turn their attention, as we said before, towards recalling Matt Targett a little bit later in the window.
Over 5,000 watching, so it's a good opportunity just to plug our charity event for Age UK North Tyneside Dementia in the summer. A nice little warm-up to the World Cup, Saturday the 6th of June. We've got the return of the entertainers. It's a walking football match. Peter Beardsley is leading the line for the entertainers. We've got Rule Fox involved, Steve Howie, Lee Clark, Darren Peacock, Kevin Scott, Steve Watson. And on the other team, which is a media team, we've got Joe Allen managing it. We've got John Anderson. We've got Simon Pride, Razor. And we've got a few of the Geordie journos alongside Lee Ryder and Charlie Bennett as well. Tickets are on sale now from our website, nufcmatterspodcast.co.uk. That's the place to get it. And don't forget, Peter Beardsley and Kenny Wharton are being interviewed by Joe Allen on the 30th of this month at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets again available from nufcmatters.co.uk. Supermac and Gibbo has been added to the bill. Supermac unable to do this Friday. He's not feeling too well. We send him our best wishes, but hopefully he'll be back on his feet, he says, by the 30th. So we've got an evening with some Newcastle legends that night with everyone. Your tickets will be valid from the Supermac event to go to the Beardsley event. So I think Woucher will have been in touch with everybody with regards to that. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, so let's just focus on your questions again. And we've got a few good ones coming in. Let's go to as many as we can with regards to players rather than finance. Where do you think, says Tom, Jean-Philippe Mateta will go? He's just put in his letter to the club today, asking to leave in this window.
Yeah, I don't even think that it's asking to leave in this window in a formal sense now. I think he told them last year that he was exploring options and he wanted to leave. So Palace won't be surprised by this. But when you consider Gay has gone and Oliver Glasner's going at the end of the season, and it was tense after that defeat to Sunderland, Glasner would prefer Palace to either have a striker, if not two strikers through the door, then sanction the exit, or not sanction the exit at all. Mateta's preference last year was categorically to go to Italy. And first he had Milan as an option, but nothing materialised. And then this January, Juventus, but the deal formula and the overall finances of the deal not possible for Juve to pull off. Mateta's wanting about £150,000 a week. And in addition, Juve were only ever going to do a loan formula. And I think from Palace's point of view, it has to be a permanent exit and money that's too good to turn down. Otherwise, they're not going to engage. So Mateta currently doesn't have an active Serie A option, even though that league has been his preference for quite some time. And that's where Villa is going to be really interesting, because as we broke on TalkSport 2 days ago, if Villa don't get Tammy Abraham over the line, which is a complicated deal because Besiktas's conditional obligation means Villa have to fly to Istanbul to negotiate whether they can get him out of the Turkish club, even though technically he's a Roma loanee. And as a consequence, if they do that, they bring back a player that they had in 2018, 2019 that got them promoted from the Championship under Dean Smith. But if they run into a roadblock there, I think there is a concrete possibility that Aston Villa are the ones that bid for Jean-Philippe Mateta. And then he'll have a big decision to make, whether he wants to go now and play under Unai Emery and back himself to start games ahead of Ollie Watkins, or alternatively wait and see whether another Serie A option materializes in the summer. That's where we stand. I don't see Newcastle entering the race. I don't think Newcastle could match the players' demands either. But Villa from England are the most likely suitor. But just keep in mind that if they do Tammy Abraham, then Mateta, because of his wage and Palace's desire to keep, could potentially be short of winter options or be prepared to wait for an Italian move in the summer. And then in terms of Palace incomings, there are some options. I know Evan Gessan from Villa has been spoken about because he was a Crystal Palace target before the player ended up joining Aston Villa. but also Sheriff Siddiqui, or Siddiqui Sheriff, I should say, from Angers, is another young forward that Palace are currently in negotiations for a fee between 20 and 25 million euros. So that one also could get over the line for Crystal Palace, especially if Mateta does depart.
4 minutes left. Asula to stay at Newcastle.
Yeah, I think they were exploring all kinds of options to see what was right for the player and right for Newcastle, but he's ultimately contributing and playing enough games, and I don't think necessarily Newcastle want to leave themselves too thin. So there was definitely some suggestions of some form of departure towards the beginning of the window, but at the moment I think Newcastle's perspective is perhaps that they just want to try and not lose any squad depth, especially in areas where they're not expected to strengthen between now and the end of the window. So it wouldn't at all surprise me whether the 22-year-old ends up staying, and he's made 14, I think, appearances in all competitions, and he scored 2 or 3 goals. So from Eddie Howe's point of view, we'll wait and see if Ross Wilson agrees, but from Howe's point of view, I think his plan is to keep hold of the player.
Jamal Lascelles to leave in this window.
Again, I just don't think that they want to leave themselves thin. It was looking pretty likely from what I heard that Lascelles would go somewhere in the winter window when it first opened. But now Newcastle, because of injury, have kind of got a consideration if they're going to sanction any kind of move. Coventry had made an inquiry. West Ham United also had the player on their radar as well, and Betis were quite interested too. They made a call about 10 days ago. So it's not impossible. And in the long run, Newcastle are obviously willing to do business as they revamp their defence and lose some older players. But right now, I think Eddie Howe, who still has a lot of control in recruitment, even since Ross Wilson has joined, is making a really clear point here that the last thing he wants is to lose squad players and find that Newcastle are thin. Because if you sanction something like Lascelles and you pick up another injury, then obviously you're in big, big trouble.
Callum Wilson to return on a short-term deal.
No chance there. And again, wage is another stumbling block. With Wilson, it's fascinating because 2 weeks ago, he was basically gone. And West Ham and Wilson were discussing a termination, and Wilson was going to be a free agent. And as I broke, Celtic inquired, and Al Shabab in Saudi Arabia had invited Wilson over to kind of look at the club. And they were really quite confident 2 weeks ago that they could get a deal over the line, but they were waiting because they didn't want to go to West Ham and offer a kind of nominal fee, knowing it was very likely that Wilson would be a free agent. So Celtic and Al Shabab and Burnley as well, they all kind of waited, assuming at that point that they'd be talking to Wilson as a free agent. And then the last sort of 7-10 days, Wilson, who's always been a model professional, scored the winner away at Tottenham, and suddenly West Ham want to keep him. So now I'm not expecting Callum Wilson to go anywhere.
Last question from Craig. Do you think Eddie Howe picked the players to sign this summer?
I mean, Eddie Howe will always have a say. I'm not aware that he's got like an out-and-out veto or complete autonomy. And now Ross Wilson has come in. Clearly, they have to develop a working relationship. But prior to Ross Wilson, it was sort of Eddie Howe driving a lot of things, because Newcastle, following the departure of Paul Mitchell, were left in a period of flux. And Andy Howe and Eddie Howe, plus the ownership group and the leadership group, were all sort of simultaneously involved. Remember when they were out on that mission to try and sign Benjamin Sesko and doing Nick Voltemade, it was people like Nixon and even Jamie Rubin that were directly involved in the negotiations. So very hands-on from the ownership or the leadership. But now things have settled, and obviously the highly regarded Ross Wilson, who's a great hire for Newcastle, is kind of running the show. And Eddie Howe is there somewhere alongside him, inputting and challenging, but he doesn't quite have the same autonomy as he perhaps did over the summer when Newcastle were without a sporting director. And he doesn't maybe have the same dynamic as he did with Paul Mitchell, where he was still given a lot of power and say. I think Ross Wilson is running the show. Ross Wilson is liked internally by Newcastle, and Ross Wilson has a very strong relationship from day one with Eddie Howe. But Howe understands that Ross is driving these signings, not the manager. So compared to other Premier League managers, yes, Howe maybe does have more say. And I think if he really put his foot down, even though there's no formal veto in his contract, I don't think that Newcastle would necessarily go for players, but generally speaking, the manager is never the one single-handedly doing the recruitment, and that's the same at Newcastle United. And Ross, I think, is seen as doing a very good job since he's come in under challenging circumstances because it's mid-season and there's financial considerations. But from what I hear, Mitchell, when he was there was kind of some tensions from day one, and the dynamic between Mitchell and the football leadership team, if you like, was always a bit of a work in progress. Whereas from day one, I think that Ross Wilson and Eddie Howe are actually really aligned, and that bodes well ahead of the summer. And I'd note also a relatively underrated figure at Newcastle United that, you know, we might end up hearing a little bit more about over the course of the coming weeks or years. And that's Jack Ross, who, as you well know, is a former football coach, used to be at Sunderland and Hibernian. And Jack's had a really interesting backstory because he was just a manager. But even when he was at Hibernian, which was one of his last bigger gigs, he went to Dundee after that. He was living in the Newcastle area and he was just driving up to Scotland every single day. Then after he left Hibs and had a short spell at Dundee, he then went to Newcastle and started actually as a kind of developmental coach, and then moved into strategy. And then in July, he became Newcastle's head of football strategy. And he's highly regarded. He's extremely intelligent. And even though now he's not sort of going out there and making the signings, he's fulfilling some parts of what you would associate with a technical director. So keep an eye on his development, because I sense that he's going to do big things at Newcastle United in the years to come.
Ben, as always, pleasure to have you on. Anyone who's watching for the first time, search NUFC Matters on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. We still do 7 shows a week. Ben, we'll get you back on hopefully before the end of the transfer window. But for now, thanks very much.
All the best, everyone. Take care.